Hello again, I am Blunty, and I've been doing a lot of coverage of the ROG Ally over the last few weeks. I've got a review sample from Asus and was basically left completely alone to do whatever the heck I wanted with it, and I have been. I've been having fun doing it. I've been doing VR, ray tracing, a bunch of game testing, the full review, all linked in the down below, plus a lot more. The short version of my impressions, though, is this thing is pretty sweet, very capable, and surprisingly powerful. And for most of you hearing this, it should actually be available now. There are people with pre-orders taking delivery as I speak. Hope they've been enjoying it as much as I have. And while I even found ways to not only run thirsty games like Cyberpunk 2077 at 60 FPS and still look pretty nice, and even got it to run with ray tracing on, believe it or not, there is one thing I touched on in a few videos, but obviously couldn't really do any reasonably informed speculation on, was another high hype game coming, as we now know, in September. I spoke a little bit about it when I tested Fallout 4. I am, of course, speaking of Starfield. Space Fallout. No Man's Skyrim. But now we can begin to speculate reasonably, or perhaps guesstimate might be a better portmanteau, because along with the release date and the price, we now have minimum and recommended system specs for the PC release to measure against. And no, while we're on the subject of performance and specs, I have no interest in mocking, ridiculing, and deriding or clowning on the console plebeians who will be locked to 30 FPS for this game. I am already tired of that discourse, and as someone who will be playing this on PC, I am above it. Morally above it, spiritually above it, and evolutionarily above it. We are better than this, PC gamers. Better than console plebs. Look upon our works, our FPSs, and our mods, and weep, TV screen slaves of the console lower races. I promise there was a point to that. I'll get back to it later. And anyway, Tears of the Kingdom is one of the best games of its kind I've ever played, ever, and it's 30 FPS, and that's fine, so I'm sure it'll be fine for Starfield console players. In any case, with the context of these officially stamped specs, we can now nock an arrow and draw our bow and take aim at an estimation of how well Starfield might very well run on the ROG Ally and its growing family of similarly spec'd handheld gaming PCs rocking AMD's 7840U variant APUs, rocking Zen 4 CPU cores and RDNA 3 GPU cores. It is a glorious dawn for PC handheld gaming. So, join me on a short and vague-ish journey through the muddy waters of comparative PC hardware dingle measuring. And thank you to each and every one of you who deigned to leave a comment, some thoughts, some guesses, some corrections perhaps, opinions on whatever in text form in the down below. The thumbs are there too, just FYI, and thank you especially to the Patreons, glorious and kind as you are. So, while those of us with an even semi-operational human memory will be playing a bingo game of what is Todd Howard lying about this time, because Todd Howard always lies, so that's fun, there is at least one thing we can point to as a reasonable fact: the system specs Bethesda carve out and have printed up as practical and recommended. We can skip by several of these, an SSD being required, for example. The Ally has a nice fast one, easy. Windows version, easy. DirectX 12, easy. Internet, easy. 16GB of RAM, no worries there. No, the big things are, of course, the CPU and GPU. The Ally uses an APU, which is AMD's name for a chip that has CPU stuff and GPU stuff slammed into the same physical chip. The CPU side is easy. The Z1 Extreme APU in the Ally is a slightly modified version of AMD's 7840U, and it has 8 CPU cores, 16 threads using AMD's Zen 4 architecture. Lots of beef there. It is in fact well above the performance level of the Ryzen 5 2600X. Mentioned in the minimum specs. Using the TimeSpy benchmark as a quick and dirty comparison point, the Z1 Extreme gets a CPU score of about 6500 when at the default 15-watt performance mode, while the 2600X scores about 6400. While the recommended spec of a Ryzen 5 3600X scores about 7300, and the Z1 Extreme can outclass that in turbo mode, scoring at 9200. So, without even maxing it out, the Ally's CPU is comfortably within the minimum and recommended specs. Now, it is of course very important to note at this point that synthetic benchmarks, like TimeSpy, do not always directly equate to real-world performance. There are other factors in play when you're playing a real game like a normal person, which is a big reason why all of my coverage of the Ally so far has been entirely based on real-world use, and I've done zero artificial benchmarks, I've done zero charts or graphs or any of that kind of crap, because it's not that useful outside of intellectual exercises. But for our purposes here, it is a useful tool for making some estimations, and it is, until we get the game, one of the only ways we can do any sort of practical comparison points. Now though comes the tricky part, the GPU. Inside the Z1 Extreme are 12 RDNA 3 cores. This arrangement is a little bit harder to line up against direct GPU equivalents. But we'll stick with TimeSpy as a yardstick, as while it is a canned benchmark, it is very well established and has proven to be nice and consistent at the very least. While Bethesda recommend a GPU of an AMD RX 5700 or a GTX 1070 Ti, that's pretty high as a minimum spec by today's standards. So, the RX 5700 that Starfield wants as a minimum spec pops out 8,300 on TimeSpy's GPU score, and the GTX 1070 Ti scores 6,800. And the Ally's GPU cores pull in 2,562 in performance mode and 2,852 in turbo mode. That is less than half of the 1070 Ti's score. That could be an issue. If you're curious, the closest TimeSpy GPU scores to the Ally include the likes of the GTX 1650, being a little below that, and quite significantly above a GTX 1050 Ti, even when it's at 15 watts. Now, the problem is, nowhere where these minimum specs are published is it mentioned what the target is. And we can make a fairly safe assumption that given Todd Howard is now on record as so committed to the visual fidelity of the game at the expense of the frame rate on consoles, which is why he's determined to target 30 FPS and not 60, he wants the game to look prettier, not run smoother. See, there was a reason why I mentioned that console stuff in a PC-based video at the beginning there. Todd Howard thinks it's more important for this game to look pretty than run smooth. Or as he spins it, he wants a 30 FPS consistent experience. But whatever, you can argue about that elsewhere. So given this context, we can probably very safely assume that the standard target on PC for minimum specs is indeed 1080p 30 FPS at low settings. And I've already demonstrated and spoken about more than a few times in other Ally-related videos that while its excellent screen is a 1080p native one, I have found quite a few games, especially the ones that are more difficult to run, the ones with more grounded, realistic and detailed but slightly stylized looks like Cyberpunk, like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, can and do look surprisingly good at 720p, even 720p upscaled using FSR. The pixel density of that 7-inch screen with its excellent clarity and rich colors does tend to hide a lot of the crimes of lower resolutions in a lot of cases. So with that in mind, and the context we established before, I don't think it's out of the question that even with the GPU falling below recommended specs based on synthetic benchmark comparison points, that we will indeed be able to run Starfield on the Ally, and I expect we'll be able to get there by running at 720p, maybe native, maybe upscaled, likely with the additional help of FSR 2.1 in the quality or performance settings. And here's another promising comparison point to sort of help drive this home. Star Wars Jedi Survivor. It too has unusually high minimum specs, asking for at least a GTX 1070, just one step down from the 1070 Ti, and the performance delta between those two at 1080p is roughly about 7% or so, depending on the game. It flutters, of course. The point is the 1070 is not that much slower than the 1070 Ti. And indeed, I have been able to run Jedi Survivor on the Ally, targeting 45 FPS with decent consistency, and I have a whole video on that one if you want to see the exact details of performance and the settings and what compromises were made and how it looks and all that sort of stuff. Short version is, I can get it very, very playable and still looking quite nice. Even though, on paper, the Ally falls below the minimum specs when it comes to the GPU stuff. The point is, it was done. The minimum specs are not the be-all and end-all when it comes to this stuff because there are other factors in play and other context we have to think about. So, while comparisons like that are tricky, not least of the wise is, well, Jedi Survivor is an utterly different game running on an utterly different game engine, despite both games being set in space, I suppose. It is a promising example nonetheless, and a practical example of a game that runs despite falling below, again on paper, below minimum specs. So I think the Ally owners can hold a little hope that Starfield, in your hands, may very well be achievable. At the very least, docked should be a practical option. But I guess we'll see in a few months. I don't think Asus are going to ask for this Ally back, so I should still have it in hand by the time the game launches, and I will absolutely be testing it there. So stay tuned, stay subbed, hit the bell, blah, 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 blah. Thank you very much for watching. I am Blenty, and we'll catch you next time. And thank you especially, as always, to the patrons scrolling up above there, whose above and beyond support is, astronomical. It's above spec.